So it's going to be tough at times. Certainly there were a few tears at the launch event last week, and those people mostly knew me quite well as well. So the topics will include suicide, alcoholism and cancer, which are all ones I've been closely associated with, unfortunately. So I'm just going to give you a bit of background about me. This is me growing up in a nice middle-class environment in Hull. That was the school I went to, Hymers College, and I was involved at an electronics laboratory. I worked for a company called Humbrol, which some of the older people in this room will probably remember. Little paint tins, studied hard and ended up at Fitzwilliam College here. And this guy here, is anybody from Australia here? No. Dick Smith, he's very famous now. He wasn't then, but he's the Richard Branson of Australia. And I worked for him randomly in 1974. He just had one shop and he became a very famous entrepreneur and explorer. So for instance, he was the first person who circumnavigated the world in a helicopter by himself. Well, that's quite a big task, crossing the Pacific Ocean. But the first introduction really to entrepreneurialism was, well, it's a combination of Dick. My father's a dentist, ran a small service business, and then I set up, or I bought Brainchild, which is a discotheque, a travelling discotheque, which is a very different thing. So I was a DJ in the old sense of the term, which is taking a disc and putting it on the turntable and let it go round. You nothing else, not like the new disc. So I'm just going to read a little bit, just a minute or so, about some of that story, which is in the book, of course. I had to sign a risk assessment to sit on this, except I haven't signed it. I haven't signed it yet, so come and grab me, somebody. I hope I'm loud enough. This really is the first time I've read out aloud since, as we'll come to later, some AA meetings 24 years ago. I'll just launch straight into it. But the second year, which is my second year at university here, sped by with academic work and running a travelling discotheque called Brainchild. My friend Chris and I had bought this disco from two veterinary postgraduates. The two vets had run it for a while, but felt the time had come where they ought to concentrate on their studies. And they kindly lent us the money, £20 each, and we paid that back from profits. One of them had a minivan which was just big enough to carry the equipment and vinyls of course, and hence provided the transport to and from the gigs, taking 1/3 of the profits. This was a tiny business, more of a hobby really, but it taught Chris and me about marketing, selling, pricing, customer relationships, providing a service, sourcing vinyl singles, accounting and repairing. Many years later, I worked out that we earned less than would have been the minimum wage in those days, and any food, but in all cases we had access to drink and any food provided, and we loved entertaining and making people happy on the dance floor. A few events stand out. One was in the Cambridge Guildhall, where we were the accompaniment to a band who wouldn't let us use their amplification equipment. And this was fine before they came on, but when they went off for a break after playing for a while, our speakers were so underpowered that we couldn't even hear the music ourselves, and we were on the stage. At one disco, Chris and I decided to test our bladder volumes. He won after consuming over a gallon of beer before needing the loo. And the only event we did in someone's house, so generally they're always in Cambridge colleges, resulted in the neighbours calling the police and making us stop. That was in Shelford. So that was my first introduction to running my own business. So we go on from there. So the first part of this talk is about my successes, and then we'll move on to the various tragedies I've had in my life. This is a number of images. So I lived in Germany. That was getting married. Actually, that's in Whittlesford at the Tickle Arms, in the garden there. First child, Matt, who was born in 1984. And then I set up a company called CamData, which you might just have heard of. It's the Cam in the name sort of sounds like it's something to do with Cambridge, which it certainly was. And we're still running that. My wife and I are running that after 40 years, although it's had a very rocky ride. Anybody who's read my first book, Investor, will have read about that. Also did some property project, built some houses. This is the CAB near the station where I was the project manager. And jumping forward a long way, I became one of the Cambridge Angels. And from the Cambridge Angels, I bumped into Robert Marshall. And I'm just going to read a little bit of a story about how I formed Martlet with him. And some of you will know Martlet as a VC, which was spun out of Marshall's about 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm no longer involved with it, but I was obviously since 2011. So read this bit out. So both Paul, he's another Cambridge Angel, and I were accepted into the club. Beside more informal meetings, the Cambridge Angels also holds dinners for members. And one day at one of these dinners, I sat next to another member, Robert Marshall, the fourth generation of a Cambridge-based family business called Marshall of Cambridge Holdings Limited, founded in 1909, and I'm sure many of you know the company. We then had several thousand employees in aerospace engineering and car distribution, as well as owning and operating Cambridge Airport. Robert mentioned he was looking for a bright young person to help the company invest in early stage technology companies. I said I was definitely not young, and no one can identify themselves as bright, but I was definitely interested. He was an engineer like me, and we both wanted to help early stage companies. Me with time and a little bit more money, he and his company with connections and a lot more money. Has anybody got investment from Marshall's here? No. A couple of Thai meals later, I met with the Marshall CFO, Bill Daster, and also Robert's father, Sir Michael Marshall, chairman of the Marshall at the time. I got to know Sir Michael well over the next 8 years and came to think him of as much a gentleman as my own father. And hence, with the agreement of the Marshall board, Martlet was founded. This name was chosen because the mythical bird of that name is on the crest of Pembroke College, where both Bill and Robert had studied. But I like the fact that in heraldry, it's a bird that has no legs, and hence it's always on the wing, learning from and observing the world below. This was a turning point for me, as it meant I would spend 1 or 2 days a week sourcing investment deals and helping startups grow. It also meant that my relatively small investment was leveraged by Martlet money. Our philosophy was to be part of an angel round, in those days called a seed round, and now commonly known as a pre-seed round, writing one of the bigger checks. The investment committee consisted of 3 engineers, Sir Michael, Robert and me, plus an accountant, Bill. So like all early stage investors, we tended to invest in technology that we understood, especially hardware rather than software, which frightens most angels. And I've just had a conversation with somebody here about that. For good reason. Software companies scale by increasing the computing power, but hardware requires long design cycles, component sourcing, stocking, physical distribution, all of which limit the rate of building a business. So they're not as attractive to angel investors, since more capital is required and the risk of failure is higher. So that was the start of Martlet. And then I moved on and sort of got noticed by people here in the UK. Basically, I joined the Angel Co-Fund, which is a government-backed body, and they introduced me to the trade body, the United Kingdom Business Angel Association. The bottom left there is me with a very surprised look in my face, winning an award which was Angel of the Year. The one above it says Best Angel Investor of the World. I didn't really trust that one, particularly as it doesn't have a date on it, so nobody else can win it. Other things, this is a lovely piece of Irish fossilized wood, which was another award, Best Exit of the Year in Europe. There's some of the investments here. So the Cambridge Seymour Sensors, and I saw Florin Udrea's picture up along the corridor here. He was the CEO of that originally, and that exit allowed me to buy one of my many midlife crisis cars, which I've no longer got. However, I didn't buy that aeroplane. Some of you might remember Ego airplanes, which failed in the end. Dogtooth Strawberry Robot, you might know that, that's in Melbourne. But I'm just going to talk about 2 stories from that. So this is about the top right one, Captive Media. Does it mean anything to anybody? It was designed in Cambridge, and the first installation was in a pub in the marketplace here. 2 years later, I invested in and joined the board of another startup that eventually failed, called Captive Media. Gordon, its CEO, had been on Dragon's Den, where he'd been resoundingly told that all the dragons were out. But we, a group of angels, decided we were in and put in over £2 million over the next few years. Gordon had come up with a novel and imaginative way of advertising to the notoriously difficult target group of 18 to 35-year-old males. The company's strapline was, "This is the world's first contact-free, networked, interactive washroom media system with hands-free control." And it was based on many neuronals aiming their stream to control the animation of a skier or beer bottle. Some of you, beer bottle moving around the screen just above the urinal. So there's no contact, contactless. This is infrared sensors for the techies in the room monitoring this stream of liquid. The company built hundreds of installations in the male toilets of pubs and gave hundreds of thousands of hours of amusement, but the advertising revenue was not quite at a level to keep the investors believing in Gordon's dream long enough for the company to become profitable, so sadly it folded. However, I regarded the journey as an elegant failure. When Gordon was at the launch last week, so still friends, as Captive Media shut down without owning a penny to anyone except the shareholders. In other words, paid off the taxman, paid off all the staff and everything else. And I'm really keen on that. And if anybody's read the first book of mine, Investor, closing down a business solvently if it runs out of money is really, really important in my view. So that's one example of a failure. But let's just look at a success. And have you heard of James & James, anybody? Fulfillment company, was in Foxton, then Sawston, now in Northampton. No. It sort of competes with Amazon, but at a much smaller scale. In 2013, I had invested in and joined the board of a company that developed software to manage a warehouse, similar to the fulfillment part of Amazon. The software was being tested on a tiny warehouse with a few racks of shelves and a few customers. Both founders were called James, hence they chose the name James & James Fulfillment. Over the following 6 years, we grew the business to over 100 employees and profitable sales of over 15 million per year. Now, as an angel investor, having a profitable company in your portfolio is pretty unusual. That wasn't in the book. By 2018, we had decided to bring a strategic investor into the company because we were significantly profitable. We could raise money from a private equity firm. I could then sell my shares, and the two founders could sell some of theirs. Venture capital companies generally don't like existing investors to cash out, i.e. withdraw their investment when they, the VCs, invest. This is because the VCs want all the cash they invest to be used to grow the company even faster. PE, private equity investors, however, are comfortable with some money being taken out by founders and investors. The James & James exit was progressing well, and on the 5th of March 2020, which was the date of the first confirmed COVID death in the UK, and 18 days before we went into the first lockdown, I experienced my second company exit event where I was a board member. The first one was actually here in Cambridge. We got to the solicitor's office in London at lunchtime and did not get home till 4 a.m. By this time, people were starting to expect a UK lockdown, and the atmosphere was beginning to change. There was fear in the air, events were starting to be cancelled. We wondered if the private equity house, LDC, which is Lloyd's Development Capital, would change their minds. To my surprise, and I don't know who in the room's been through an exit, there were still points to be discussed, so there were lots of cups of tea while trying to avoid discussing COVID, until our solicitor, Inga Anson, some of you might know her, decided we should move to the buyer's solicitors. It was now mid-evening, and the atmosphere was getting quite jolly. The people required for the meeting were arriving, and it looked like they were coming from home or for a night out, and the pizza and beer arrived. These were a different world to the one I was used to. I was quite uncomfortable with the joviality. People were a bit drunk, there was lots of laughter, whereas to me it was a serious occasion. We were trying to close the biggest deal I'd ever been involved with, and there were huge sums of money, by my standards at least, involved. It might have gone horribly wrong. It felt inappropriate. Senior management at LDC had actually spent most of the day working out how to support companies in their portfolio that would be affected by COVID, such as hospitality and travel. However, we thought we'd be safe, as if the UK locked down, like many countries were planning, online shopping and therefore fulfillment would increase. And if it did, it doubled in turnover that year, as it turned out. Eventually, all the documents had been signed except the final one from LDC. By this time, it was 2 a.m. and their CEO had gone to bed. This led to a slightly tense period for us until the signature followed in the morning and the money arrived a few days later. I'd bought 4% of James & James in 2013, and 6.5 years later, I sold my shares for 107 times what I'd paid for them. I wasn't allowed to invest as much in the company as they didn't need the money, and the founders didn't want to sell much of it. I didn't want to be diluted. But the result was, if not exactly life-changing, at least house-changing for both. Alison, who was my wife. The exit paid back all the money we had invested as business angels to date, the break-even point for angels, where it's only upwards from there. I've since found out that many angels never reach that point, and if they do, it often takes 10 years, and it had taken me 11 years to get there. So, that is some of the successes, but as we all know, the book is called Public Success, Private Grief. So this is going to be a little bit more difficult. So we wind back 30 years. There are 3 family members there. That was my brother, David, who died of leukemia when he was 21. That was back in 1980. My dad had a long life, fulfilled life. He's 85 years old there, going up in the glider. Proud of the fact that he was healthy until within 2 or 3 weeks of his death. And that's my sister, who died when she was 51 of alcoholism. I'd sort of experienced death at a relatively young age. And then my alcohol started to get out of hand. I'd been a fairly heavy drinker here at Cambridge, but not, I don't believe, alcoholically. This is a graph there, which is the sales of CAM data, or the order intake, not the sales of CAM data, when it went through the beginning of 1990. I know some of you will have been in business then and recognized the depth of the recession we had in 91, 92. It turns out that, in fact, capital expenditure stopped here, and it took quite a long time before it filtered through. But trying to, run a business when the orders just fell off like that was really, really tough. And we went bust, and in fact, I phoenixed it after that. But these photographs show me, obviously, I've chosen ones that make me look a complete idiot, because that's what I'm trying to demonstrate that drinking was going on. This was 6 months or so before I'd had my last drink. It was the 3 boys and the photograph that we took for my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. So that's 1999. But then things got worse. There's a term which you've probably heard called rock bottom. So if somebody is addicted, it's commonly said that they will only recognize they have to go somewhere when they get to their rock bottom. And that rock bottom will vary from people to people. And I just want to read out an excerpt from probably the most difficult time in many ways of my life in terms of what I'm ashamed of. So this was in September 99, so about 4 weeks after that photograph was taken. So in early September 99, I went to Scotland with Matt. So Matt is, you saw a photograph of him earlier on, he's my eldest, who works for Stephen Peirce now, actually here in Cambridge. I went to Scotland with Matt, who was 15 at the time, to climb Ben Nevis. What happened next is something I'm more ashamed of than almost anything else in my life. Showing the madness of the practicing alcoholic, I drank while driving all the way up to Scotland. Matt decided I was too drunk, so he confiscated my car keys and rang a friend in Stamford, where we were living. The friend then contacted my parents, and they were in the mid-70s, who drove up to rescue Matt. It was agreed I would have the car keys back and carry on. My parents and Matt would stay the night in a hotel and then take him home the next day. The next day, I mixed a half a litre of gin with orange juice to disguise the alcohol, which I drank as I successfully climbed and then descended the highest mountain in the UK. Back in Fort William, I jumped in the car in order to drive some or all of the 450 miles home. I remember little of the next few hours, apart from the fact I got lost in Glasgow. This was before sat-navs. 2 hours later, I stopped on the side road to relieve myself, and the car got stuck on the verge. A kind passerby helped me push the car back onto the tarmac, and also, as it turned out, rang the police to say I was drunk behind the wheel. Without me noticing, a marked police car started to follow me and stayed with me for many miles on the M6 motorway until I stopped at a service area near the Lake District. The police car parked next to my car, and the officer beckoned me over. I sat in the passenger seat of his car as he told me that I hadn't committed any traffic offences, so he could not stop me any earlier. I remember to my embarrassment uttering the words, "It's a fair cop." After drink driving for many years, I had been caught miraculously without having injured myself or anyone else, and I felt I was getting my due comeuppance. I'd had a few close shaves. For instance, just before Christmas the previous year, the police were stopping everyone and looking at drivers, but not breathalyzing them unless they suspected them of being over the limit. I'd been drinking in the car, but looked respectable and drove a nice car, so they made the assumption I wouldn't be a drink driver. This time round, I was breathalyzed and found to be more than 3 times the drink driving limit and taken to the police station, breathalyzed again, charged, placed in a police cell. I had behaved, I believe, in an exemplary fashion throughout, politely and cooperatively, so I was allowed out without my car keys to stay in a local pub for the night and told I could have my car back as soon as I blew a clear breath sample. The pub had a room, and I did then what any alcoholic would do and asked for a pint of beer. and then another one. After a poor night's sleep, I got my car back at 6 a.m. after passing a breathalyzer test, rang Margaret, who was my girlfriend at the time, and who together with my parents had had a terrible night as they knew I'd been driving and suspected I was drunk, and I had not been able to contact them for over 12 hours because my mobile phone was still in the confiscated car. That is the depths that an alcoholic or other addicts can get to. I just want to talk now about the bottom line here, which is the actual point of my rock bottom. So examples of the behaviour that I thought acceptable included using a towel over my mouth to prevent vomiting when I took my first drink of the day, sometimes before breakfast, in order to stop my hands shaking. How can any rational person take that as acceptable behaviour whilst knowing that the day was now ruined? As an alcoholic, one drink always leads to another. One of the AA sayings is that an alcoholic will never be able to control which the last drink of the day will be. Only sleep or unconsciousness will define that, probably with a half-empty glass of one's drink of choice by the bed. While I was a so-called high-functioning drunk, as described earlier, over an hour of each day would be spent hunting for alcohol. I had 7 shops in Stamford where I bought my alcohol, making weekly visits to each, and numerous pubs, so I could live in the illusion that the shopkeepers or pub landlords didn't know I had a drink problem. I could have and did have days without drinking any alcohol. I remember gradually reducing my drinking over the days before an event when I needed to be sober, perhaps an important customer meeting or a day with the parents and kids. However, such a plan would invariably crumble under stress. For instance, when I really wanted to go to the funeral of a very good friend from school called Tony, who died in his early 40s of leukemia, I couldn't trust myself to be sober enough for the day to drive there. So to have a very good solid reason not to pick up a drink during the day, I took up amateur dramatics. Not on stage, but on the lighting desk, as I'd done as a schoolboy. The idea was that this would stop me drinking in the day, because I would then be letting down the cast and technical staff in the evening. This worked really well until the first night. Wednesday, the 22nd of March 2000, and the first night of the play, The Night of Iguana. I have no clue what made me pick up that first drink, but why should I? I'm Peter, and I'm an alcoholic. I remember none of the play, but luckily my lighting mentor was in the technical box doing the sound and overseeing me. The next day I woke, and although we had the second night of the play coming up, I picked up a drink again. Philip came round. Philip was a friend who was doing my driving, actually. He volunteered to do that. Came round to see how I was, and I stumbled on the garden path and fell, just missing a boot mud scraper with those 2 vertical prongs that could easily have killed or seriously wounded me. I don't remember this myself, but Philip told me later I had said I'd rather be dead than continue as an alcoholic. Philip realised this may be a rock bottom for me and gently convinced me that it might be time to attend a rehabilitation clinic again. I was in shock about what had just had a near-death experience, and as it happened, I was in that particular state between sober denial and drunken stupidity, so I said yes. So this is 2000, and we move forward, and some of what of the success is building at this point. Some of you would probably know that I lost a son in 2022. Some of you might even have known Alan. He was well known in the community. He was a co-founder of Investor with me, and he then joined Martlet and worked for them. But I'm not going to talk about Alan today. There's something about in the book, not very much, because it's still very recent, and there are a lot of people who knew him well who are still grieving, particularly his widow and his brother. But I just want to talk a little bit about Ian. So Ian's death was in 2009. That's Ian on the left there. He was 23 years old when he died. This is the last photograph I have of all 3 of them together. That was at my mother's funeral in 2008. And in fact, their mother had died in 2006 of a pulmonary embolism when she landed at Johannesburg Airport. So she was a frequent flyer, and what was probably a DVT had spread. So this is now the roundabout the 3rd anniversary of her death. This is quite painful. It was late July 2009, and I hadn't heard from Ian for a few weeks. We mostly communicated by text message with occasional calls. As mentioned above, he'd been living in Glastonbury for the last couple of years, not working, but living off the inheritance from his maternal grandparents. Glastonbury is an unusual town, attractive, rolling English countryside, close to the location of the famous music festival. Many of the residents practice a New Age lifestyle, rejecting modern Western values, instead emphasizing spiritual ideas and beliefs, astrology, alternative medicine, meditation, and so on. There are many myths and legends related to the Glastonbury tour, King Arthur and the confluence of key lines. Ian was very spiritual and loved it in Glastonbury. He could mix with people who had similar values and views. He could relax and meditate. When he'd visited Ladakh, he'd lived with a local family and started to adopt some Buddhist principles. There he took the name Namgyal Essence, shortened to Nam, and this is how he was known in Glastonbury. Namgyal is a common Tibetan Buddhist name, meaning victorious, and essence may have been a reference to spirit. As he was living from his inheritance, he had time to help others with their problems, whether these problems were emotional, spiritual, or practical. I had texted him several times because I wanted to tell him about the annual reunion of Focus 12, the drug and alcohol rehabilitation charity where I was chair of trustees, and about a visit to my dad, his granddad, who was now alone after my mother died 16 months earlier. But Ian hadn't replied. This is before the days of WhatsApp, and it wasn't possible to see if a text had been received or if it had been read. I was becoming more and more uneasy and had contacted one of his close friends who told me Ian was in a better place than he had been for a while. On Tuesday the 11th of August 2009, I was working at my desk after having dinner with Alison, her children, and Alan, my son, of course, who was sitting in the lounge next door watching TV. I'd done the annual appraisal of the managing director of a charity that I chaired, was emailing the trustees about the outcome when my mobile phone rang at 10:45 p.m. I picked up the phone. The caller asked, "Who's that?" I said, "Peter Cowley," and I immediately asked him the same question. It was late at night and it was an unknown number. He said he was a police officer, giving his name, rank, and police station. He was called Jared. He went on to explain that the body of a young man had been washed up that day in a small cove along the coast near Bristol. A farmer had found him and the body had been taken to a morgue, but although he was clothed and wearing a rucksack, his only possession was a £10 note. The body has some unusual tattoos, and they had checked his fingerprints against a national database. The fingerprints appeared in the database under Ian's name and were linked to a mobile telephone number, and that number was mine. I said I didn't believe him. I'd ring the police station. Jared gave me the number, which I checked on the internet. I rang back in total shock. He explained that Ian had been fingerprinted after an incident some time ago when he had been stopped for jumping over a London underground barrier. Ian had given his real name, but my mobile number rather than his own. The rest of the chapter goes into more detail about how I coped with helping the police in identifying who he'd spoken to at the last, so they could release his body because they thought foul play might be involved. And he also talked about how I built up a narrative in order to go through the grieving process. That's about all I say in the chapter on Alan. So some of you know I've got cancer, and as this shows, I'm just talking to John actually. We were both running in the same half marathon. So this was October 21. I'd learned how to run at the age of 63 in 2019, and I'd gone from not running at all to my first half marathon at the beginning of 2020, and that was the second one I did because of COVID. So that's October 21. So 3 weeks later, I found I was unsteady, and this is, as the medics in the room or anybody in the room can tell, there's something wrong with my lung there, and that's because there's a tumour there. So I'm now going to read out one more excerpt. This is a bit later stage. So I'd been diagnosed at this point and put onto this drug here, osimertinib, which is, in fact, was invented not necessarily in Cambridge, but by AstraZeneca. And it's their best-selling drug. So they did $7 billion with that. recently, well not recently, the last year, and there's literally probably a couple of 100,000 of us on that. And as you can see, it's what they call a small molecule. It's called a targeted therapy. It's a daily tablet I take, and it identifies the cancerous cells, it recognizes them, and stops them being able to multiply or reproduce. It has, in my case, extremely few side effects, a little bit of broken nails, occasional mouth ulcer, etc. So I've led a very positive and fulfilled life since that was discovered. So I'm in my 27th or 28th month. There's a couple of things I'll mention there. So this is a month or so after I start taking the drug. On the physical side, I still had some balance issues caused by the tumour in my brain. So as you can imagine, the lack of balance was due to, well, in my case, it was due to a tumour of about 27 millimetres in my cerebellum. So but I was on steroids, so a combination of the steroids, which reduced the swelling around the tumour, meant I at least got some of my balance left, and then this drug gradually kicked in. It doesn't kick in for everybody. On the physical side, I still had some of the balance issues caused by the tumour in my brain, and it was predicted this problem would continue for a while until the drug started to work and the tumour would shrink along with the others, which I'm very pleased to say it has done, of course. I continued to play golf, spectacularly badly due to my unsteadiness, but with great gusto and enjoyment. I was gifted a trip in a Spitfire airplane by two friends, so I secretly increased my steroid dose for a few days in order to be able to walk to the plane in a straight line and not turned away by the pilot as unfit. An old university friend who was on his own cancer journey introduced me to the wonderful concept of the fuck it list. For all the things you don't actually need or want to do, the inverse of the bucket list. You might have guessed by now that I'm a spreadsheet junkie and immediately started to keep both lists. I actually enjoy most of what I do, so I don't have any major items on that list, but it's still a useful concept for setting priorities and seeing which activities I can scrap more easily than others. After about a month in mid-February, so this is mid-February 2022, so a couple of years ago, we made our first regular visit to the oncologist. We mostly discussed the side effects I was starting to experience, and they were pretty bad at the beginning, which were mainly skin-related, not too serious, dry skin, mouth ulcers, brittle nails. I had not yet managed to reduce the steroids down to 0, so there were still some sleep problems, and I was also quite short of breath. I felt my general health was deteriorating rather than improving. The oncologist told me to be patient, but he did order a chest X-ray to investigate the shortness of breath. Being patient is definitely not one of my core strengths, and I class myself as an impatient patient. I came to the consultation knowing that I had an invitation to speak on a panel in Paris for the European Research Council 3 weeks later. I was keen to go to let them know as soon as possible I was coming. These are things I really enjoy doing. So I asked the oncologist, who I guess Andrew actually knows. Andrew was my cardiologist some years ago, to point out. I really enjoyed doing. So I asked the oncologist if it was okay to travel. Well, it's probably a good idea to stay fairly close to home for the time being, i.e. Adam Brooks, he was talking about, to see how the treatment beds in. I've heard what you said, and I'm going to Paris. As we walked out of the hospital, Lisbeth was giggling next to me. Honestly, if you're going to ignore his advice, you need to tell him face to face. As we talked it over, we decided it was just a train ride, no further than somewhere in the UK, really, and we were going to manage. We planned to make a bit of a holiday out of it as well, a trip to Reims and to Paris. So that's probably some of my attitude, but although I have a very good working relationship with the oncologist, and if he hadn't been at a lung cancer conference in Belfast last week, he would have come to the launch event. On the right there, you can see Lisa and I in France having a lovely meal. In fact, we're going there for our first wedding anniversary in June. And this is me, as you might have seen on social media, sleeping out in Antarctica in January this year. It wasn't as cold. You can see the snow's a bit soft. It was about one degree, but it snowed. We're in bivvy bags, no tent, and it snowed all night long. So it's really pretty uncomfortable to sit there with the snow falling on your head. And we've done a fair few other things as well. I'm just going to read one more. So I'll just move on to one more slide, the last slide. And at the back of the book, there is my reflections. There's a longer version. So on the website, so ps-pg, there are two things you don't get in the book. One is a set of photographs, some of which you will have seen here. So photographs that are associated with chapters through the book. And secondly is a longer version of the reflections. So this is looking back at various things in life. And I'm just going to read one section of this, and that'll be the end, and we'll go to Q&A then. And the last section, right at the back of the book, is a letter. Some years ago, I did a letter to my 29-year-old CEO self, which again, some of you might have read. It's in the third edition of the Investor book. It's on my website, and it's Frog Capital, VC in London, that asked me to do it. So that was to me as a CEO of CamData. This is different. This is me as a late teenager. So this is a letter to my 19-year-old self. Dear Peter, you will go through tough times. Many will say that you've had more than your fair share of family deaths, health issues, and business failures, but you've coped and been resilient. Some lessons that you will need to learn are these. You will be told many times that life is not a dress rehearsal and that you've only one chance at it. So don't waste your life. Grasp opportunities, contribute to others' lives, but also have time for yourself. Related to this is don't sweat the small stuff. This is a bit hackneyed, but so important. Life is full of priorities, and the skill to work out what you want from life, and hence making hourly, daily, yearly choices, takes time to develop. You were born into a family with a comfortable income, but lacking the ability to communicate emotionally. It will take until your early 40s to develop a level of emotional maturity. Read and use professional help as soon as you can to build up and develop your emotional intelligence. You'll never be worried about collecting assets or about your appearance. Stick with that program, as experiences are much more valuable than assets. However, you should keep a better eye on your weight. You'll reach your adult minimum weight in your mid-20s, and then you'll lose control of your weight for the following 40 years. Although you will continue to play squash, you could easily have needed new hips or knees. Don't take 45 years to learn how to enjoy running. Start now. You've started to keep a personal diary. Please spend a few minutes a week maintaining this, as it will make writing your memoirs a lot easier. I actually kept 47 years worth, but only 7 years of personal. The other 40 years are calendars. And with Lisa's help, this isn't just a book about what I've done on holiday. I can assure you, Lisa spent a lot of time drawing out of me my emotions and feelings as to how I coped with all the various things you've seen there. You will become a parent who feels they didn't spend enough time with their kids as they were growing up. Please make sure you do spend enough time. You will dislike speaking in public until your mid-50s, when you finally take Ian or NAMS counselling and learn how to enjoy it. Start doing that now. You won't prioritise reading novels. Try and allocate enough time to read at least one novel a month. Personal relationships are key to a good life. You will have 3 marriages, 2 with a relationship of over 17 years, and 1 unlikely to last 17 years unless you're lucky enough to be in the long tail of advanced cancer sufferers. You will adopt strong opinions weakly held in your late 50s. It will take many decades to develop a big enough audience that your opinion is heard. We all have and need stress in our lives, and you will learn to recognize that stress can be beneficial in avoiding procrastination. But you'll develop an intense addiction to alcohol to anesthetize yourself from personal stresses, and this could easily kill you. You will spend at least a decade in denial of that fact. Please face up to the reality that you have a problem as soon as you can. And finally, good luck, stick to your core values, never give up, help others, and enjoy life and be kind to yourself. So that's the book. So I'll hand over to Chris. Can I just, at this point, and Lisa doesn't know I'm doing this, could you just come up and say how we worked through the book, the decision to make it?
Oh, well.
Yeah, just so you can introduce yourself, because it's a joint, we co-authored.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's very, very clearly Peter's story, but Peter is a bullet point man, a numbers man, a facts man, a businessman, and I'm a word person and an emotional person, and I read, and arts and culture are important to me. So I would describe myself as a cross between a ghostwriter and a ruthless editor. So I wrote some of the chapters from scratch, and other chapters are made from sort of Peter's raw material, and I tried to write it into prose that is hopefully easy and pleasant to read. And most importantly, I think, we had long conversations about things that have happened and how to put into words how Peter has dealt with things, so how he feels about things as they were happening, which were not in the original. So hopefully we've put that into the book, Because what Peter hasn't really talked about in the last 45 minutes is how he actually grew through these traumas and how he learned how he used this grief to channel it into helping others and into helping others and into making a narrative about what happened so that he could carry on living. Because how do you get up in the morning when things like that happen to you? So that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah,
Sorry.
thank you. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I should just say that Lisa and I met, it's in the book, in the third UK lockdown. So we met in the beginning of 21 and courted at a distance, as you can imagine, because we weren't allowed within 2 meters of each other for 2 months or something. And then 9 months later, I get cancer, and then 10 months later, Alan dies. And then actually 3 months later, we got engaged in the Galapagos, and then June last year, we got married. So Lisa's been through, that's where the tears coming from, probably, been through a hell of a lot. But she's been absolutely wonderful. Right, let's get to the Q&A.
Peter, at least, thank you so much. I mean, I don't have the vocabulary to do justice to summarise that, so I won't even bother trying. It'd be great if anyone's got any questions they want to ask Peter or Lise.
Can be personal or business or whatever you want.
I've got one.
Oh, Mark.
We've known each other for a while, and I'm just interested in the extent that you, through writing the book and being on YouTube and talking about it, it's almost to me, it felt like you were using those processes to help you as well as helping others. And I'm just trying to understand the difference.
Yeah.
Between the two.
So this is actually being recorded, and I'm just going to repeat the question because I've got a mic here which is going to the system there.
Yeah.
So this is, Mark is asking how much of the process of writing the book, and I haven't mentioned, but I have a YouTube channel called Project Cancer where I've documented how I've coped and all the various things, communication, working with the NHS, prioritisation. I've also done about 30 podcast interviews. Billy Boyle, you'll possibly know the people in the room, that his wife died of colorectal cancer. I interviewed somebody recently who's got cancer with an unknown primary. A lot of people there, and I released that about 7 or 8 months after being diagnosed. And in that month time before that, I had a private page on my website that's password protected, so that's how I communicated with other people. So, Mark, your question was asked me before I started writing. Well, not before. They actually said, you'll find this cathartic. And my response to that was, no, I don't think I will. I know my story. But I absolutely have. There's no doubt that I think if you just put it down in the way that Lise had it, as in almost a set of events, it was a bit more than that, but that it might not have been. But because Lise has drawn out of me my emotions and other things, how I coped, I've also learnt about something called post-traumatic growth during this process, which is a term that most of you probably don't know, but I discovered that at a suicide conference, the International Association of Suicide Prevention. I've realised that actually, yes, I have worked through an awful lot more. This isn't quite answering your question, but I'll cover the other point in a sec. A lot more than I possibly thought I would do. And it sort of comforts me that because statistically I probably won't last more than another year. This is based on the huge amounts of data with all the people on that particular drug. That I will have, I'm at ease with what has happened in my life, I believe, because of the process of doing this. The sharing is and some people, a number of people have read it already, so it's brutally honest, and I've overshared to some extent to their view. Just been very, very open about things. That's been my way of helping others for a long time. We met because of the Citizens Advice Bureau here in Cambridge. Oh, did I really? I don't even remember that. But I've been helping on charitable boards for many years. Focus 12 was the drug and alcohol one, the Citizens Advice Bureau at various levels. And then I started mentoring entrepreneurs, and I've mentored and probably hundreds and hundreds, maybe even 1,000 entrepreneurs. So giving back has been sort of in my character probably since I recovered from alcoholism. But the way that I'm open here is certainly isn't done for my own brand. It certainly isn't done for money. There's no way that we'll ever make money on the book. It's to do with my legacy. It's to do with sharing and helping other people. So that has been very beneficial in the way I've coped, particularly probably with the suicides, the strong ones. Yes.
You talk with very admirable candour about your own failings, alcohol in particular, if we call that a failing. How hard was it for you to realise that yourself? I mean, at the time, did you think it was good that you were drinking? Did you ignore the world, or did you always realise you were doing something wrong?
Yeah, so the question is, how deep and long was the denial, I think. I'm going to summarise it as that. So denial is so strong. It's so incredibly strong. One rationalises the most ridiculous behaviour when you're addicted. You've obviously got the physiological addiction to it. So there is the body, and the shaking will start if you don't drink, if you stop drinking suddenly. But it was a year. It was 10 years. It took me about 10 years to realise. And if you do read the book, you'll see that it's the third time I'd been to rehab. I went to rehab in 95, 96, or 94, 95, and then finally in 2000. When you're in the depths of addiction, that's all that matters, really. It's, you know, I don't think anybody in this room knew me then. No, I'm sure you didn't, because I was living up in Stamford, not in Cambridge. So I was as you can imagine, very different. I was in love with only one thing, and that was alcohol. Nothing else. The kids suffered from it, relationships suffered from it. I'd managed to run the business, CamData, somehow. I don't know how I coped with that, but I did. So no, denial was so strong. And although I haven't said now, I started going to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, which I have a huge amount of time for, the day I got banned from driving, which was in September 1999. And it took me 6 months of turning up to AA meetings drunk sometimes, which is generally frowned upon, but it's okay if you're a friendly drunk. If you're an aggressive drunk, you'll get kicked out. And it was only through that process of osmosis, really, that there was something else other than addiction. But it's still, I needed to go to rehab again to get through that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and thank you for being so candid.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Do you think there's an aspect of your character that's helped you succeed in business that's also helped you cope with the grief as well?
Yeah, so is there an aspect of character that helped me succeed in business? There will be, there's sure to be. It's a combination of probably research and focus and project management process. There's a number of things that being an entrepreneur seems to be similar to the process of working. This narrative, you know, I mean, Project Cancer is very clear. You know, I'm looking at it, I'm positive, do as much research as, you can't over Google because you get some really horrible things if you look at Google too far, but knowing what to learn about, what to research, who to talk to, etc., and the communication. So that compared with not building a business, but at least running a business is very similar.
But there's also the busyness is to some extent the success is a result of keeping yourself very, very busy in order not to have to think about things or deal with things.
Yes,
or
but
keep revisiting tragedy. Keeping yourself busy has been
so as you
that's
see,
led to success.
there's a level of over-business. I wouldn't necessarily associate over-business with being entrepreneurial, but being an entrepreneur is pretty all-consuming, particularly if things are going very well or not very well, maybe not if they're stable. So yeah, there's no doubt I focused. When you stop drinking, suddenly there's an awful lot of hours in the day you've got to fill, basically. Many hours, you know, like 7, 8 hours. What are you going to do with that? You're not going to sit in front of the TV for 7 or 8 hours. So I sort of learnt to be busy, and that business has definitely helped when there's been a real crisis. It's been like an anaesthetic, effectively, because I've just got on with it. The CAB project, this was before I'd met Mark. After Ian died, I actually went to a meeting the following day. Somehow that was the distraction I needed to carry on. I'd warned them. I went with Rachel Talbot, who was the CEO then, and she knew the story, and I warned them that it's going to be difficult, but I just felt that necessary. And so there may be a connection there with entrepreneurialism.
I'll ask a cheeky question. You've been very honest about the businesses that, investments that haven't succeeded, is there one that you think should have been a great success wasn't for any reason?
Yeah,
A
so
favourite that should have worked?
yeah, I'm also very open about my angel investing, as you probably know, on petercowley.org. There's a list of all the investments. There's also a list of all the successes and failures. And I put a statement next to the failures, which is my interpretation. And so far, no lawyers have actually written to me to say I shouldn't be saying that. Almost all of the failures are because a company runs out of cash before it reaches product market fit. And product market fit means you've got a product or service that the market wants at the right price, so you can actually get to break even. What has failed? I've not invested in any hospitality. I mean, in the end, entrepreneurs should be able to work out what might go wrong and cope with it, sort of, you know, in other words, plan, just in case. So in my view, a big bad debt is the entrepreneur's fault. It's not the customer's fault. You shouldn't have advanced so much credit in that situation. Obviously, COVID was probably not plannable for, but I'm never invested in any hospitality or travel or anything like that. So I haven't actually met that with that. What has actually failed that shouldn't have done? There's one called Loomjet. Does anybody know Loomjet? No, you do know. Oh, yeah, you will do, because it's in the same field, of course, aren't you? Which was a printing machine that took, colour printing, probably 6 times better quality at a third the price. Now, that sort of stacks up, doesn't it? Expensive machine, mind you, so the capital equipment cost was very high. But you would have thought that would be an obvious thing. I mean, printing sort of dropped and it's picked up again now, but you would have thought that would be an obvious thing that industry wanted. Turned out it's because, partly because you're putting in photographic paper one end and it has to be kept in the dark rather than just sheets of paper, and you've got a wet process in there as well. And so I was really surprised in the end, bearing in mind how many patents they had, how advanced the technology was, that failed. So it wasn't a recession-based thing, they couldn't get product market fit.
Thank you.
Okay.
And so each of these have got copies of the book for you to buy. And didn't I read as a charitable donation?
Yes,
part?
to Papyrus, charity for prevention, young suicide prevention,
Brilliant.
between
Yeah, so
19 and 34.
no, under 35. So after Ian died, I didn't really get involved in work it out. There's an organisation called Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide, which you might have heard of, SOBS. I went to their annual conference. After Alan died, you might have seen it on social media, we raised £60,000 for suicide prevention. And not just that, but mental health. And about half went to Centre 33 here in Cambridge and Peterborough, and the other half went to Paris. And if you know the 3 dads walking, because they started working on Wednesday, actually Andy, who's one of the 3 dads, is chair of the committee I'm on, so I'm on the finance committee of Papyrus. So I decided, I mean, obviously give it to other charities, cancer charities, etc., but I decided it was the closest to my heart is definitely suicide prevention. It's astonishing. There's still, although the number of suicides has come down over the years, globally it's about 700,000 now rather than about 1 million 20 years ago, there's still 700,000. You know, there's still an awful lot of work to do. And in most cases, and again, you might be aware, 3 out of every 4 young suicides are male because 2 reasons. One, we don't talk as well as women do. And secondly, unfortunately, we tend as males to use violent methods and women use non-violent methods and therefore more likely to survive. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.